Okay. I want to start off this debate by establishing some of the key premises because I think this debate requires a ton of characterization that OG will do a good job in setting up, as you'll see. So what is this religious duty exactly? I think it's doing something because it was your duty or your obligation under the stipulation of your religion, or it's something that you were taught by a authoritarian religious person in your life, and you have been cultured and nurtured to feel that doing that particular act is something that was necessarily important for you, and it was something that was closely intertwined with your religion, such that committing that act would cement your place as a devout follower in that religion. Second one is this idea of a mitigating defense. So mitigating defenses in criminal justice systems do not necessarily mean that you're not guilty. It basically lowers your criminal liability and the punishment accorded to an individual. For instance, existing mitigating defenses like those of unsound mind, undue influence, extraneous factors, these are all things that the court will take into decision after the individual has already been termed guilty, but uses these mitigating defenses to determine what are the most appropriate and equitable punishments that have to be set out because of all these kinds of factors. For instance, an individual who has committed murder but is successfully able to plead the mitigating defense of an unsound mind would probably have his murder charge reduced to one, possibly of culpable homicide, which then reduces the kind of punishment that will flow from that. What are parameters to this debate? So I think obviously there are limits to the use of mitigating defenses, especially when it comes to the most heinous crimes, in which case, even if it succeeds, it will still entail a pretty severe punishment, for instance, a life in prison. So what do these crimes look like? What these crimes that stem out of religious duty actually look like? They probably look like things like honor killings that are committed, infanticide as decreed by this particular religion. And we think that these are things like our policy is no different from the other kinds of state policies that are already in place. For instance, in Singapore, the law already recognizes and takes into consideration particular religious lines of individuals that possibly can interfere with state policy. For instance, Jehovah's Witnesses in Singapore are granted permission to not bear arms despite having the mandatory national service for us like Singaporean sons, which therefore shows that the state already has is already consensus to this idea of like religious people not being able to fully participate and not being fully in line with state policy, which also shows how the state already has some consideration and places some importance on the idea of like practicing religion in all countries. So what is our policy for today? We think that using religious faith as a basis for mitigating factor has to be supported with extensive material evidence. That is to say, you have to be able to prove that there was a sufficient proximity between the nature of the scripture and the teachings together with the action, such that it is reasonably foreseeable for an average layperson to view the act as a natural byproduct of the teachings of that particular religion. Which means that if your religion encourages A and you do Z, that is something that will be extremely difficult to establish proximity by, and the mitigating defense will probably not hold. There must be sufficient justification evidence to show that your act was a byproduct of that particular teaching, of that particular scripture, and that your religion actively encouraged that. The same way, like in how all mitigating defense are analyzed and justified in court. What is the principle for our house today? We think it's in the state's endeavor to produce the most equitable criminal justice system, it needs to be able to mete out the most equitable judgments and punishments for individuals whose lives have no other alternatives and where their unique position in lives necessitate a different form of treatment. For instance, mentally ill individuals probably do not get as severe a punishment as those that have a rational mind. And in the same way that the state also recognizes you have different obligations because of your specific standing in life, you are also accorded different treatment. For instance, richer people get taxed heavier than poorer people. We think it's no different in our case. We think the state has to try to endeavor to look at every case on a case-by-case basis to analyze what is the most equitable treatment for that particular member in society. Two arguments for the house today. First, how religion is no different from an indoctrination and there is a need to protect the most vulnerable. And second, how this creates the most effective of running of the most conservative states. So first, on how religion is no different from indoctrination. So we think that the idea of having your mind change and your entire perspective of life change is something that is a very real environment for especially those from the most conservative states like India and Myanmar, where religion plays an extremely crucial role and has a very close part in their lives. This looks like, for instance, people growing up within a certain religious sect and believing that to be the reality of the world. They thus behave in ways that the religion would preach, believing it to be the right way at a point in which their neighbors, their friends, their pastors, all their kinds of authoritarian figures, their parents, all tell them that you have to act in this way because this religion is also your way of life. This is the reality for the most conservative states. And we think this is the most particular and this is the site where the most kinds of religious crimes are more likely to be committed, because these are the places where these individuals probably do not have any kinds of opt-out clause, meaning that they probably don't have any other alternatives but to follow in that particular track of mind. What this means is that these individuals are unable to attach their actions to a rational frame of mind to view that, for instance, like vandalizing the scripture of another religion is something that's necessarily bad, because that was what was taught to them by their particular religion to be the correct way in exercising their religion and the correct way in practicing their religion. And recognize how their world is only one that assumes that, recognize how like opposition's world is one that only assumes the best of the most rational people, without taking into consideration the inability for those who are unable to opt out. That is to say that their world, in the absence of having like this as a mitigating factor, it shows that the assumption in their world is that these people are able to actively choose that doing this thing and make the moral decision that doing this thing is particularly bad, which we don't think that these people can make, especially in the context of a conservative state where they are drilled day to day with these kinds of religious teachings. It's incredibly hard for them, therefore, to opt out, making this defense necessary and almost akin to the ideas of coercion, of extraneous influences, and of course of undue of mental illnesses. And these are all already pre-existing mechanisms in place under mitigating defenses. But on the second argument on how this creates the most effective of running of conservative states, like I mentioned to you before, I think that religion already plays a significant role in states in general, such as in Singapore, if Jehovah's Witnesses not allowed to not bear arms even in national service. So we think that especially when governments want to run conservative states, when they recognize that the majority of the population has an extremely conservative religious slant, taking into consideration this is the demographic, we think it's necessary for these kinds of governments to attribute religion into the kinds of governmental policies that they roll out, into the kinds of judicial systems that are implemented. This shows that the government has a due respect for the people on the ground, the most conservative people on the ground. What this means is that it is more likely for the government to be able to use this religion also and work within this kind of framework in teaching these individuals on what are the necessarily harmful teachings of the religion, rather than painting itself as a direct opponent to the kind of religion that they teach, not taking into consideration what their moral stance are. We think it's through this kind of organic process where the government can take a step-by-step approach in first incorporating and respecting the importance of religion before teaching these things or these important values on what their correct action ought to be, and that is how you create the kind of change in society that they want. For all these reasons, we cannot be proud to stand on government.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the leader of opposition to start the op case. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
All right. The stance of opening opposition is that we're not going to allow religion to be a mitigating defense. Before I move on to my points, there are two things that I would like to note. First, understand that mitigating defense can be strong enough that the liability that is reduced goes to the extent that you don't get punishment at all. I think it is a big cop-out coming from opening government for them to claim that there will still be a degree of punishment at the end of the day. The reality is, if your lawyer is that good, he or she can use that mitigating defense to the extent that you escape punishment fully. Take the example that they utilize. Unsound mind as a mitigating defense is sometimes enough that you don't even get prison sentence, but you go to an asylum where you're going to be treated by psychiatrists, i.e. no punishment whatsoever. Secondly, I want you to note that the examples that they utilize are very, very convenient, right? They talk about infanticide and honor killing, which I would like to clarify, in some states, it's already something legal to begin with. Their characterization of no opting out clause work in a conservative state, but the problem with conservative state is that those are states that sometimes even put infanticide and honor killing as something that is legal, as something that is justified, as something that can easily go through a religious court and you can go scot-free. So it is not even a crime to begin with. We think that what they need to justify is in areas like a relatively progressive state where there are things that are not legal, but you can utilize religion as a mitigating defense for. What am I talking about? I'm talking about killing Jews because they come from a different religion. I'm talking about acts of homegrown terrorism, because what happened when homegrown terrorists are brought to court? They claim that Islam made them do it. They claim that this is part of what they do for the sake of jihad. That's what they need to justify. They need to prove whether mitigating factor exists in those cases or not. I want to talk about two things rebuttals indicated. Number one, I want to talk about what are the parameters of mitigating defense, when do we give a mitigating defense, and why religion does not fulfill those parameters and should not thus be a mitigating defense. Secondly, I want to talk about how the entire government bench just ruined law enforcement big time. Let's begin with what are the parameters of mitigating defense. The first one is universality. What does it mean that it is universal? That is, everyone, both you and me and everyone around us, can agree that this particular mitigating factor is something that will boost your chance to commit crime significantly. That is, if I have that mitigating factor, I will probably do crime the same way you who have mitigating factor will do that crime. That's why psychopathy, ladies and gentlemen, is something that is considered to be a universal mitigating factor. Why? Because once you have psychopathy, you have no choice but to commit crime simply because you cannot determine right and wrong. I'll take a POI after my first point, right? So there is a universality in psychopathy when you lose that ability to determine right and wrong. The thing with religion is that there is no such universality, because even among the religious individuals, many argue that what you are doing is simply perverting the interpretation of that particular religion. They claim that they have that religion as well and they do not do crime, so there is no reason as to why this religion is something universally creating crime in your side. For example, Muslim clerics that explicitly condemn act of terrorism, Muslim cleric that condemn the rise of jihad by claiming that jihad should not be done through a violent manner, but it can be done by the form of discourse and discussion. What is even worse is that there is no proof whatsoever as to you doing this because of the religion, or you is someone who actually want to do the crime or decided to do the crime, and you use religion and a perversion of that religion as a justification for it. For example, Salah Abdeslam, the person who committed the Bataclan Paris attack, he is someone that owned bars, and that is a very big Islamic sin. But when is seen in his Facebook media profile, he claimed that Islam made him do it. That shows you how universality simply don't exist. But secondly, I want to talk about the act of opting out, because they claim there is no opting out, that this is a religious indoctrination, right? We disagree. We think that it is true that a standard of mitigating defense is that if you can't opt out. And we agree that you can't opt out of psychopathy. You can't just suddenly not have it if you already have it. But the thing with religion is that opting out is much, much more possible. Why? Because we think that there are other religions around you. Okay, we agree. Maybe you need to opt out from the community that you are born with. You need to opt out from what your parents teach you. We agree. But we think that there are two reasons as to why that is still very feasible. One, we think it's relatively easier to find new community. In the event that your religion is that radical that they justify crime, we think that they are most likely a minority interpretation that are ultra radical. And the thing is, it means that they are disproportionately small. We think that finding a more moderate religion that are the majority is significantly easier. Secondly, in the case of radical religion, we think that government oftentimes denounce this religion to begin with. So there's a state support coming towards you to find a new religion. Third and finally, I want to talk about religious rights. When can religious rights actually be absolute? Because that's what they're doing in their side. They're claiming that suddenly this religious right of these religious people are enough that they get a mitigating factor. We don't think so. We think that religious right only exists as an absolute in a private sphere, but it cannot transform and transcend to the public sphere. Why? Because in the public sphere, there are individuals who do not consent and who do not agree with the religion that you have. That's why you can't do an imposition of that religious value to other individuals. That's why gay marriage marriage is legal, even though you might disagree because you came from a certain religion, but you can't just say no, because if you force it, then you are imposing value to people who do not consent. Note that what they are doing is they are imposing religious value to the victims of the crime that are committed by these religious individuals. Victims who now won't get as big of a compensation and as big of a closure because somehow these religious rights of these people become absolute. We think that while state must respect conservatism, it doesn't mean that it should not separate state and religion. Final point, ruining law enforcement. Because the thing with psychopathy is that you can have psychiatrist comes in and verify the truth, right? But how do you check a religious defense? Presumably, that is something that can only come from a religious expert. So what you can do is bring a religious expert from your own organization that have your own interpretation, which means you'll probably be able to go scot-free or have some really, really reduced punishment. What will this impact you? Secondly, the case study in which this is most relevant are acts of terrorism. Terrorists like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, homegrown terrorists that use religious defense. The problem is, they now know that they can escape using a religious defense. They are more unwilling to negotiate with law enforcement and share crucial information that can be necessary for us to combat terror. What are the information I'm talking about? Key terrorist target, how to de-radicalize, all that is gone. We proudly oppose.
All right, thank you very much, Leader of Opposition. I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the opening government case. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Can I just have a couple seconds? Dear Speaker, I think what's very important to note within this debate in and of itself is that when opening opposition says that mitigatory defense can also account to these people being completely acquitted of certain crimes that they commit, it is disingenuous for them to say this as being part of the debate in and of itself, because this debate is about being able to provide an opportunity for that defense to exist within the first place, which is to say that regardless of how your judicial system works, regardless of how long your case runs, regardless of how good your lawyer is, whether or not the lawyer can actually use this as grounds for being able to defend something, it is what is going to be the primary burden that side government has to defend in and of itself, right? And I think we do this fairly well in opening government when we actually tell you why religion then meets the bar in terms of being able to have this sort of this sort of liability being reduced in and of itself, right? Obviously, if you have things like jihad, where like a certain terrorist has committed complete genocide of like thousands of people, then he's not going to say that I am a Muslim, which is why you are supposed to grant me like immunity, or you are supposed to acquit me of my crimes, or you're supposed to lessen my punishment to a very large extent, because that is simply not how the judicial system works, even if we were to engage with them on their impact. Let me quickly give some rebuttals by actually trying to characterize what our stance really is on our side of the house, right? So what we think these crimes actually essentially look like, and Darren tells you this very, very well, is basically in a country like India, these are certain people who are going to maybe say destroy an alcohol shop because it's in a Muslim community and whatnot, and they're going to vandalize this particular space. This looks like in a sacred Hindu land of Ayodhya, when there's like a certain mosque that is being built, even though the temple needs to be built there. It's at that point in time when the people who go there on the ground and engage in riots are then granted a lesser liability and a lesser punishment for their crimes. And Darren also gives you the example of people like Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll take you later, Vincentius. Give the example of Jehovah's Witnesses in Singapore who are ready to go to jail simply because they do not want to wield arms while doing things like national service. We think it is simply justified for the state to then have complete equity over the sort of religious minorities that exist within their state, to ensure that these particular people are not being jailed because they believe in a religion that they have been brainwashed into, that they've been indoctrinated into. We think these people live a life of no alternative in and of itself, and it is And it is again disingenuous for opening opposition to claim that they can easily go away and find another community, which is my second rebuttal to their entire case in and of itself, right? Because it's not that easy. And I'll tell you why later on in my speech about how these people are basically convinced of the sort of things that they are doing. They are indoctrinated to an extent that it is completely insane. And it is at that point in time when this is equivalent to a poor person committing a crime of desperation, a poor person not actually being accounted the same level of liability for breaking and entering as, say, a celebrity or a superstar who has absolutely no or little reason to do so, right? So it is at that point in time when we feel that the criminal justice system works on a fluidity when it comes to criminal liability in and of itself, which means it makes it justified for religion to be included. But I'll deal with that later, right? What do they essentially tell us? They tell us that, oh, but religion doesn't have universality in and of itself, because the criminal justice system apparently in their world works on a system of black and white, or a system of right and wrong. If you're a psychopath, and if you can be proven to be a psychopath, which also incorporates their fourth substantive about how do you check a religious defense, is something that I'll actually tell you now. But it's all about saying that it is in that point in time when, taking their own example of a jihadist, right? Let's actually like unpack this bit of material. So if you are a 17-year-old who actually is committing crimes like jihad, and then using the fact that you are a minor to be able to not be accorded punishment, and at the same time, if you're a 9-year-old, we think that the criminal justice system recognizes that the 9-year-old has lesser liability than the 17-year-old in and of themselves, even though they have both committed the same crime. But the basic premise is that being a minor is something that you are less liable for within the judicial system in and of itself. And we think that within that sort of scenario, you have this fluidity that exists. And they tell us, how do you check these particular religious defenses or not, right? This is where our mechanization becomes extremely important. What is this religious duty and what does it essentially look like, right? You have to be able to prove within court sufficiently using your criminal defense lawyer that you are a devout person of a religion, which means you have a history of your family being extremely religious, you have attendance to certain religious institutions, you're a part of like a Hindu right-wing group called the RSS within India and the BJP, which actually like assaults couples who are unmarried within these particular states, because you have been convinced that that is the absolute truth. It is then again not okay for opening opposition to come up and claim that in the Baketin Paris attack, when this particular person claimed that he's a religious guy, and at that point in time, it's so clear on his Facebook that he owns a bar, everybody knows that this person is not a devout religious individual in and of itself, which means that it is very easy for a public prosecutor in that scenario to be able to shut down this particular proposal or appeal of a criminal liability or of a mitigatory defense that is coming in from the defense lawyer in and of itself. Right? Darren tells you two things. It gives you the principle of why the criminal justice system needs to be more inclusive of coercive circumstances in and of themselves, right? Because these people live a life of no alternatives. They've been indoctrinated as such. They have believed these particular things to be the truth in and of itself, right? They have been taught that what the Bible says or what the Quran says is the absolute truth. They attend various religious institutions, and they claim on opening opposition in itself that these are people who are ultra radical and part of the society, and that is where they lose the debate. Because the moment that you recognize that the people who are part of this debate are the ultra radical people, these are people for whom religion is a very core part of their system, which means that they cannot simply just opt out of that community in and of itself. Right? And we think that in itself is a problem, right? Recognize that the criminal justice system itself does accord equity because it actually recognizes mitigatory defense of duty for many people in itself. Such as, for the example, it's very, very hard for the murderers of George Floyd to be convicted of first-degree murder simply because they're policemen, and poorer people also get a lesser punishment. At that point in time, why we tell you that religion meets its criteria, you're out of order. Oh, I'm sorry, you can respond to me in your speech. But we think that it is at that point in time why religion meets its bias for two reasons. One, because of circumstance. You don't choose the religion that you're born into. It's simply birth lottery that exists in and of itself, right? You don't choose the sort of indoctrination that you receive from your parents. Secondly, it's because state has a responsibility towards equity in and of itself. Given that a large amount of religious people are a majority, and we're not talking about the people who are going to be convicted, but rather people who are religious, who will see this as a measure of your justice system being more trustworthy, right? And this is an impact because the comparative on their side is twofold. The first one is that religious people have lesser apathy. Given that the state is already not separate from the church, because state universities offering things like theology courses and whatnot, and already recognizing the existence of a deity, is at that point when we feel that these people will have lesser political participation the moment you tell them that your religion is something that the state does not recognize. Secondly, they have a lesser trust within the judicial system, and this is not the people who are actually going to be convicted or who are actually going to have a case, but these are essentially the people who in and of themselves are religious. And this is extremely important because you need these people to be on your side for equity, because religion meets the bar and because opening opposition is highly disingenuous in their characterization, go with OG.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the DLO. You're here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Panel, I think it was incredibly disingenuous for opening government to talk about this debate in super conservative states, right? Because if you were committing a religious crime in a religious country, obviously those aren't things which are going to get you in jail, right? Because the state preaches that religion, and you're talking about things like authoritarian regimes. So for instance, if we're talking about like the Rohingya genocide in like Myanmar and how people there are inherently like religious and they don't want the people from the Muslim community, those people aren't criminalized. So obviously we're not talking about those people in this debate. We're talking about non-conservative states and whether or not you should be allowed to like be able to go scot-free with your religion, right? So that was something which is completely disingenuous from their case. So obviously there is not that degree of coercion that they wanted to talk about. But the second tension that I'd like to note from their case was this idea on how you're still going to give them life sentences. We're still going to punish them further. Well, then this is obviously a massive contradiction to their principle, right? Because if your principle is that they were coerced and they were blah, 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 then obviously why are you still punishing them for life, right? That was something that they never cleared up on their Safety House. I'll be talking about two things in this debate. First, whether or not this is in the principle of mitigation, and second of all, what will this do to law enforcement, and how does this fulfill the principle of the criminal justice system? So first issue then on whether or not this is in the principle of the mitigation, right? The first thing we heard from OG was to say that this is in line with existing policies by the state, how Jehovah Witnesses are able to like do blah, blah, like have their own things, right? I'd just like to note that that's not true, right? Because the separation of the church and the state does not exist in a vacuum. It only applies to your individual rights. And when your rights inflict upon other people, then the state has the prerogative to intervene, has the prerogative to put you in jail for a longer period of time, right? So if we're talking about the Jehovah Witnesses who don't want to opt into the military, that's something that has to do with their own individual freedoms, right? But that has nothing to do with other people in society who are harmed as a result of that action. That's completely disingenuous to what actually happens in the status quo when we're talking about religious duty crimes, right? Because obviously if we characterize what these crimes are, these are crimes which often force you into things like terrorism or mass murder or hate crimes, right? So obviously this is not something which they can simply ignore. But second of all, they tell you that people coerce you into religious beliefs, and this is therefore an irrational decision. First, I'd like to note that you can opt out, and I'll extend on the layers of analysis brought out by LO, right? Obviously, the reason why their examples and analogies don't work is because all of those talk about your physical things that coerce you into doing something. So for instance, if we're talking about poverty, the fact that you need to put food on your table forces you to like go and steal money or steal food, right? Or if you're talking about self-defense, you are physically threatened and therefore you act in self-defense. Or if you want to talk about age, obviously that's a biological and physical thing, right? So if we're talking about things which coerce you, the reason why they get mitigation sentences in the status quo is because they physically threaten your life. And this is obviously disingenuous and not analogous to religious beliefs. Because what are religious beliefs actually about? They're about your values and your judgments, right? Whether or not you think something is right and whether or not you think something is wrong, that has nothing to do with your livelihood and whether or not you are coerced. The fact of the matter is, secondly, that many religious people don't commit those same crimes, but the fact that you did so means that you have an active evil intention, right? Because that is something to do with your own interpretation of your religion, right? Because I just like to note the special characteristics of religion, because that is that it is open to interpretation. There are different sects of the same religion, like for instance, under Christianity, you have Protestantism, Catholicism, and the Jehovah Witnesses. Because the fact of the matter is, religion is not something which is just a one-size-fits-all policy, right? So obviously there are many different sects and many different interpretations of the same religion. And the fact that you committed a crime when other people did not means that you chose and you actively opted into a specific interpretation of a religion. And the conclusion there is that you did so out of your own intention and you should not be allowed to go scot-free. What else did they tell us? They told us that you don't choose religion and it's somehow to do with your birth lottery, right? First, I'd just like to note that obviously you can choose to opt out of your religion. You don't necessarily have to stick to the same religion. That's why we see so many people leaving their religion. But second of all, it's also your choice on how you interpret that religion, right? So obviously, within the broad idea of Christianity, yes, you don't opt into that religion, but you can opt into specific beliefs that cause you to commit crimes. So that was something which they never ignore. The conclusion of this is that when you make your own intention and you intend to kill someone and commit a crime, you should not be let go. You should not go scot-free. But third of all, we tell you that religion never preaches harm, right? Because this is the third characterization that I'd like to bring in this debate. Because the fact of the matter is no religion in the status quo, be it Christianity or Muslimism, never tells you to go around killing people. They tell you to live life a certain way, but they never tell you to inflict that life upon other people, right? What these people currently do in the status quo, and the reason why they commit crimes, is because they apply certain aspects of these religion and then they twist it in order to commit a crime. So I argue that this is something which they completely ignore in the status quo. Therefore, we think that religion should not be the parameter to which you get a mitigatory sentences. Second issue then on what will this do to law enforcement. The first thing that can characterize is the purpose of the criminal justice system, and this is something which is largely ignored by teams in this debate, right? Because the principle of the law is to ensure victim closure and to ensure deterrence. So I'm going to analyze why that's better on our side of the house. So first, let's talk about victim closure and compensation. Now, the narrative on their side of the house is that hate and things like religion are justified when they perpetuate hate crimes, right? Because if you characterize the crimes which they commit, it's things like Muslims killing a bunch of Jews in the status quo, or like Christians because their religion commands them to do that, right? So obviously on their side of the house, the moment the state legitimizes that and recognizes that the victims, that these crimes are legitimate and they should therefore be mitigated, that's the moment where you harm the psychology of victims on their side of the house. But furthermore, I'd like to note that the moment all these people use their own religious lawyers, because obviously you're going to use a person from your own sect who's very knowledgeable about that interpretation of the religion, that is the moment where all these people are going to get a lesser sentence and they're going to be able to run scot-free. That is the moment where you don't fulfill the principle of the criminal justice system, and victims are the ones who are harmed as a result of that. But second of all, I'm going to talk about information from terrorists, right? Because this is something which is totally ignored by their side of the house. How do we get information from terrorists and a lot of people who commit hate crimes in the status quo? It is by pushing them and telling them that you might get a lesser sentence if you give us information. That is harmed on your side of the house the moment they can get out through a different way, a much easier way, by calling on their own lawyers and calling on their own people from their own sect to justify their crime using religion, and they can run with a lesser sentence, right? And on our side of the house, we never give them the chance. The reason why that crucially works on our side of the house is because now we're able to push these terrorists and say, if you do not give us the information that we need, if you do not help us in our endeavors and we want to get information, then you won't be able to go run off from jail scot-free, right? On our side of the house, that is the only way we get change. What is the importance of this argument as a whole? The importance of this is when we create information, we're able to get like details on terrorist movements, we're able to get details of their plans, their leaders, the hierarchical structures, information that they never would have gotten on their side of the house. Crucially, on our side of the house, we're the only ones to ensure that law enforcement is able to stand, and we're the only ones to prove that this does not fulfill the parameters of the criminal justice system. I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much. To start the closing half, I'd like to invite the member of government. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool, thank you. Set my timer, okay. If you look at history, religious duty and inclusion and leniency towards religious duty within justice systems and systems of law is a powerful tool through which people are able to call out systems of oppression and potentially would-be autocrats within oppressive systems. We saw this, for example, in martial law in the Philippines, when Cardinal Sin was the turning point in the EDSA revolution of 1986, was the turning point when Cardinal Sin told the Catholic Church that it is time to step up against the Marcos regime. We saw this, for example, with the horrible war in Vietnam. Individuals were able to protest against that, making Nixon eventually pull out because of conscientious objection to the war. We think this is especially important in a society wherein democratic institutions are under assault in places like America, India, and the Philippines. And we think, therefore, the extension coming from closing government is that religious duty is an important way to subvert these systems of power and make sure that democratic institutions are able to stay strong. Let's be clear about the context, because I think a big problem of the opening exchange was that both of them were only debating within very specific contexts. Opening government wanted to talk about extremely religious societies, whereas opening opposition wanted to talk about relatively progressive societies. We think we're going to break this deadlock by setting this debate in the middle ground, wherein you have secular systems of law, whereas individuals may be relatively religious, and you have a relatively religious society. What is our extension going to do, and why is it going to change this debate? Number one, we think we're going to co-opt opposition's benefit. When they told you this idea about how, you can opt out of religion anyway, you can, for example, adhere to state values and other communities. What we're going to argue coming from closing government is, even in that best case, when people can opt out of religion, we say that that's a bad thing, because opting out of religion is precisely the way that the state implants and asserts religious values, its state values onto people and indoctrinates them into that. We saw this, for example, in China. Second, we're also not just going to debate particular cases, but we're going to impact this case for society at large, which how we're going to deal with opening opposition's argument about chaos and jihad and all those things. And we're going to run an impact-based case based on that as well. Before I move on, first, a few levels of rebuttal. There were a few misconceptions coming from opening opposition. They had this idea that, based on how good your lawyer is, it's easy for you to get out. Like, let me just mechanize what exactly the legal process will look like, because we don't think opening government was able to do that enough. We think that the courts will make sure that your punishment is commensurate to the kind of religious indoctrination you had. Meaning that they'll have psychotherapists to analyze you, they'll see what your interpretation of religion is, and they'll see what the various influences are. And even if it was a perversion of religion, if that perversion of religion is clear to you and is something that you understand, then we think it's perfectly valid for us to consider it under the same way as, for example, the way we would consider a crime of passion, for example, wherein you are coerced by emotional or spiritual needs. And obviously, religious defense is not the only thing we're going to look at. We're also going to look at things like, for example, the scale of harm, whether or not this was premeditated. So we don't think it's fair for them to claim that it's only the religious defense that we're going to be looking at. No, thank you. Now, let's move on to my case about resistance of oppression. Now, let me be very, very clear about the setting. We are setting this in societies wherein there are trends of, for example, democratic backsliding. That is to say, the assault on institutions of democracy. We are not saying that this is in places wherein the institutions of democracy are destroyed completely, because this debate is awash on either side. We are talking about places wherein democratic institutions still exist, but they're taking attacks. For example, you see in the Philippines wherein President Duterte is attacking media institutions, some with Trump as well. You have corruption and consolidation of power within systems of law, and for example, the parliament. This is not a dictatorship yet, but we think that if it goes unchecked, we think it's perfectly, no thank you, we think it's perfectly valid that it may happen at some point. So what do we think in this? We think that why is it particularly important that we have religion in these instances? We think that in these instances, it is extremely difficult for civil sector society to rise up against these governments. Why? 3 reasons. 1, because of political loyalties. Things like partisanship and wanting to, for example, be loyal to the current president. Like, for example, you see with a lot of senators in the Philippines, makes it extremely difficult for us to have civil unrest against these individuals. For example, things like cults of fanaticism, like, for example, Duterte and Trump command very, very strong bases that will not listen to reason and don't care about all these things. And third, you also have things like the spread of information that is becoming ideological. You don't believe things because they're factual. You believe things because they adhere to your point of view. What do we think religious groups and religious duty are able to do against these systems of oppression? 3 things. Number 1, they provide to us a loyalty that is greater than the nation. They say to us, for example, that our duty to the nation is not as important as our duty to God, or, for example, our duty to common man. That's the second thing. We also think that religions are very powerful at certain things like universal human rights and universal human dignity. And those things are especially powerful, especially when you have horrible human rights regimes, like, for example, Marcos during the martial law era, imprisoning people and torturing them in the name of the state. We think that historically, it has already been very, very important for religion to be strong against these systems of oppression. I'm going to use 3 examples of that before I move on.
Yeah, the problem with your extension is that it assumes religion will go in opposition to the state that is having democratic backsliding. In Russia, the Orthodox Christianity is working for Putin. So how do you have that assumption?
Okay, obviously like Orthodox is not the only religion in Russia, so we think there's a lot of religions that can move past it. But I think obviously we're not talking about wherein religion and the state are working together, because then that's a wash on either side. We're talking about wherein religion can crucially go against it. I'm going to give 3 historical reasons where that has happened. Number 1, in martial law in the Philippines, with the Catholic Church moving against martial law and being a crucial part of the People Power Revolution. Second, civil rights movement in America, wherein, for example, Dr. Martin Luther King was able to get a lot of power from the Catholic Church. And third, conscientious objection in Vietnam. Now, crucially, the last thing. What does incorporating religious duty into systems of law and systems of criminal justice do? 3 things. Number 1, it levels the playing field against would-be autocrats that weaponize democratic institutions against individuals. These are people that are willing to, for example, do things like constitutional hardball, using the Constitution against certain individuals to make sure to silence them and to throw them in jail. We think that we're able to make these democratic institutions level. We're able to use religion within these democratic institutions and make sure that they cannot weaponize them so easily against us. Second, this is places where we can encourage dissent, because now it is easier for individuals to get off on sentences because they're able to cite religious duty, and this is therefore a way in which we're able to assert. power against these individuals. And third, it's also a context where government officials will probably be more careful about going against religions and shutting down religions. For example, you saw this in martial law, but then if we had this law, it will be more difficult for them to do so because they know that the religions can rise up against them. We think that this argument is crucial in this debate because this is an impact that not only affects the individual that is going to be affected by this, but also the grander society and the upholding of democratic institutions throughout the world. Very, very proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much. To start the CEO case, I'd like to invite the member of opposition. Here.
Right. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, Ken.
Okay, thanks, Amrit. So set timer. I'm going to prove two things in this speech. First, I will ask what is the premise of the law. Second, I will answer why this ruins the premise of the law. And in doing so, I think I'll do with most of the debate. First of what the premise of the law is. Opening government starts by saying that the premise of the law is agency. Opening opposition responds by saying that agency exists. Note that at the point that I think opening up wins this exchange, then OG is already out of this debate because they premise themselves on the idea of agency existing. But here's my extension in closing opposition. I think that the premise of the law is not agency, but rather is to create order within society. We see this in the way that sentencing is inherently arbitrary, right? Depends on which judge you get. And the reality is we make some attempt, but not a full attempt to create a change with this system because we believe that at the end of the day, treating like the criminal's rights at the point that we have definitely decided that he committed a crime are not the most important thing here. And that's why things like deterrent sentences also exist that inherently go against the idea of treating each individual as unique because we believe that there is a bigger societal picture at play. The reason we believe this is that the premise of the justice system is that we trade in our rights as individuals in exchange for protection. We trade in the potential loss to freedom of property, freedom of movement, the classic example of punching someone in the face. We can't do that because we believe that in doing so, we gain certain public goods that in turn ensure that our rights are all going to be protected. Suggesting that agency is the core of the justice system would suggest that the main reason we trade in our rights is that in case we commit a crime that we will be treated with full agency. But the reality is that because the majority of people won't, the necessary conclusion from prioritizing the agency of these certain subgroup of individuals over the security of society as a whole is to suggest that the majority of people are trading in their rights for benefit that will never actually accrue to them. That is why the core of the discussion is ultimately about the ability for law to create order within the majority of society. I get that the response for opening will be that you didn't actually consent to the law, right? But the point is that if you actively survive because of this protection, because the system of everyone else trading in their rights protects your liberties to life, bodily autonomy, etc., we don't really care if you think that you don't consent. The reality is that in the overwhelming number of cases, you know what laws exist and you actively choose to break these particular laws. We think that in that case, that even if you didn't have full agency in the way in which you conceptualize your sense of beliefs, nobody has that anyway, right? Many people have racist parents and snap out of it. In the same way, I think it's wrong to say that because your beliefs don't come directly from yourself, that you should be excused for those beliefs. So if the key of the law is to create order in society, let's deal with closing government. I'll deal with you, Stephen, it's okay. They say, but sometimes you might want to resist bad law. I want to note that this argument exists in a strong minority of cases around the world where it happens to be democratic backsliding. But also, democratic backsliding more often than not happens with takeover of the judiciary. And that's why it's called martial law, right? Because the law is used in enforcing this. The problem with that side of the house is that even if I believe that this small minority of cases are the most important thing in this debate, it is arbitrary that the religious leader will be right rather than that the majority will be right. Ironically, what they stand for in pushing for democracy is a belief in the majority being right rather than singular religious leaders being willing to do the right thing and encourage their followers to do the right thing, whatever the right thing may be. The conclusion of this response, therefore, is that on the comparative, I will trade off the possibility of a small of religious leaders being more righteous than the elected leaders of the state for this minority of cases, if it means that I protect the right to order in the rest of the world. So why does this ruin the premise of law? There are two things I will prove. The first is that this suggests that the law must accept religion as a veto factor. And I'm going to do this in significantly more detail than opening opposition did. The problem in the status quo is that religion and the state have competing sources of moral authority. We recognize that prioritizing religion is coercive because it excludes people who don't believe in their religion. And we also recognize that prioritizing religion prevents rational discussion because the majority of individuals don't subscribe to that value system and therefore can never engage on the conception of right and wrong. And that's why we vest power in the state instead of religion. We're able to have these discussions. We're able to be inclusive towards people of different religions. But the point is, this balance requires a clear hierarchy where the state respects religion in private life, but not in public life, and is therefore legitimate in infringing religious autonomy when it crosses over into public life. The problem with this policy, and this is where I go a lot further than opening, is that it concedes that it's acceptable to prioritize religion over the public good. They may say that the point is to bring religion back in line with the public good. But the problem is that a religious leader is equally subject to the same lack of agency that opening government wanted to characterize. So you equally cannot force a religious leader to change his views on that side. And that's why the idea of Jehovah's Witnesses is especially important, right? Darren is wrong in suggesting that Jehovah's Witnesses are excused from NS. The reality is they serve 3 years in jail. And the reason for that is that we recognize a need to establish that public good is consistent, independent of religion. And the problem is that people who were previously bent to the state right on that side of the house are more likely to believe that prioritizing their religious views is legitimate. The status quo is one where we have successfully normalized the privacy of law being more important than your individual religion. But this cuts against that because it says that your religious views are legitimate. You shouldn't have to opt into the structures of the state, and therefore you should be legitimate in ignoring your in accepting your religious views. That translates on an individual level into more moderate people doing things like refusing to serve LGBTQ individuals, forcing transgender kids out of bathrooms that don't conform to their biological sex, because they believe that the state has invested the right in them to act in line with their religion and their religious belief instead of state protection. It also means an increase in the place of religion in public speech, because the ability for you to resist the public law based on your religion is legitimate, and therefore gives religions an effective veto factor over the legitimacy or the efficacy of any law that the state wants to push by saying that you encourage the individuals to act against this. Therefore, you effectively subvert the premise of law to these religions. But the second thing to note is that this policy ultimately fails the justice system in the aim to restore society to what it was before the crime, for two reasons. The first is that this mitigating factor uniquely does not serve to solve the problem, right? Opening government, when you talk about things like poverty, the point of not punishing someone for poverty is that the solution of put him in jail, but rather uplift him from poverty. Insanity, the point is that punishing him does nothing, solving his mental illness does something. But in this case, to suggest that a religious individual should be let out of jail faster, given all the indoctrination that OG talked about, is more likely to create more crime rather than less crime because they're unable to unindoctrinate him. And that means that we don't actually restore society to being safer. But second, there's less closure on that side because victims are able to epistemically understand that poor people might have to commit theft. They're less likely to understand that someone who is of a different religion had to go and shoot them or stab their relatives in order for their religion. For that reason, we're proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the Gov Whip to conclude the Gov case. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
All right, great. The problem with opposition's conception of justice across the board is that it's a black and white conception of justice. The problem with the black and white conception of justice is that not only is it unfair, but it is also ineffective in achieving the goals that they have set out for themselves today. And I'll prove that to you in two issues. Impacts, one on fairness, right? But before that, let's deal with closing opposition's extension, right? They talk about balance and they talk about how they want to respect all religions while not prioritizing over the public good. There's a couple of problems with this argument. Firstly, we think that this argument rests on the assumption that the moment you produce a religious defense in court, the judge will say, okay, great, we're done here today, you're free to go. That's not true, because even when you produce any kind of defense in court, that's not only thing the court looks at when arbitrating your case. They look at 1,000 other factors, right? They look at the extent of your crime, the harm of the scale of harm that's done, and a lot of other things, which by no means means that you will get a significantly, say, reduced sentence or will be let go. But even if you are, right, we think that that's fine. The second idea over here, and this is where we talk about balance, right? Because we want a balance in society. The problem is that opposition's case is not one of balance. Because if that were true, right, if everything we did was just to protect order or just to protect the public good, we wouldn't let anyone out of jail ever. We would never give anyone second chances. There would be no concept of rehabilitation, and we would always prioritize the victims or the people who crimes have been committed against. But that's not true. We believe in a justice system that is fair and a justice system of balance. So let's talk about that, right? First, let's talk about impacts. And over here, I'll deal with a couple of arguments. CEO wants to premise law on the idea of achieving order. Sure, we'll bite the bullet there. Let's talk about which side achieves order better, right? Because the opposition's arguments, and they had a couple of them, were one that, you know what, our side encourages homegrown terrorism. And the assumption underneath this argument is that sending these people to jail by not giving them a religious defense will somehow stop all of these acts of homegrown terrorism or chaos or whatever, right? Here's the thing, this is a false assumption, because understand why religious crimes or specifically terrorism happen in the first place. It happens when people feel that they are excluded from mainstream society. So what happens when you don't give them a religious defense? What happens when you just send them to jail for the rest of their life without hearing them out? They just feel more excluded than ever before. And what this does in turn is that it creates an echo chamber within the religious community in your society, right? This is especially true for the kind of countries that Stephen talked to you about in his speech. Countries where the legislature is secular, but your society still has strong religious influences. No, thank you, not right now, right? So in these societies, these villages feel that the state is not listening to them, that the state is being blatantly unfair to them. We think in that society, that's when the religious terrorism, religious terrorism or homegrown terrorism brews up even further, because they feel shut out, and terrorism is the only way they feel that they can be heard, right? So fighting in the name of God is the only way they feel that they can be heard. In our model, when you give them the religious defense, what ends up happening is that you moderate at least a few individuals because they feel more included in the system, which means that our model is one that leans a lot more towards rehabilitation and towards, in the long term, restoring order to your society, because in the long term, you cut homegrown terrorism at its root, ladies and gentlemen, right? So in that case, we definitely achieve their goal a lot better than they do, right? The second argument they had was, and I'll take a POI after this one, was that, you know what, they stopped collaboration because the terrorists have like an easy way out. We think this argument is a wash. There's two kinds of terrorists, ones who really believe in their cause. If they do, and if we're talking about this kind of terrorist, they're not going to collaborate with you or appeal to your justice system in any way whatsoever, because to them, God and their fight for God is so much more important than getting off scot-free or whatever you might do to them, right? Secondly, if you're talking about terrorists who are truly just using a deliberate perversion of religion and as an excuse to achieve other ulterior motives, we think that they will still collaborate with you if they think that the deal that they're getting out of collaboration is good enough. So a wash. Now I'll take a POI. Opening.
So we get information on people like Yahya Ayash and Mullah Sadiq, who are bombers who specialize in making ID, because there is a promise of an insanely reduced punishment. Now that terrorists can reduce their punishment significantly on their own using a religious defense coming from sect believers, why would they do that?
They would still do that because the religious defense is not a guarantee of freedom or even a guarantee of a reduced sentence, because if the court decides that their religious defense is not true and they're simply using religion as an excuse, they're not going to get a reduced sentence. So collaboration is still in their best interest. I just explained this. Let's talk about the rest of this issue, right? And this is where our argument comes in, because we don't think that justice is just about order. We think it's also about fairness. And there's something that Stephen explained to you where we talked to you about how religion religion and religious communities are often an important avenue for resistance, especially in the kind of countries we're talking about, right? And there are two responses to this. The one from OO was that this argument will not work in every country. For instance, Russia. Doesn't matter, no argument works in every country, doesn't mean it doesn't work in enough countries. And we explained through the example of the Philippines that it does do great good. The rebuttal from CEO was more interesting. They said, oh no, this is why you call it martial law, because the law gets taken over by the autocrats. That's not what we're talking about either, and also that's also just untrue, right? What we're talking about is places like India, for instance, where you have rising autocratic tendencies with, say, people like Modi, but your judiciary is still independent, at least for now, right? We're talking about places like that, and that is some place that you can still use our argument in order to create a more conducive avenue for resistance, something that they're not acknowledged. So this impact still stands. In terms of fairness, right, something we've already talked to you about, the only rebuttal that closing opposition had to the idea of coercion was that everything is coercion, right? So we can't use this as a legitimate defense. Here's our response to that. Sure, everything is coercion, right? But some things are more coercive than others, which is why you have special defenses for them. For instance, if you sign a contract under undue influence or under some kind of coercion, you are allowed to make that contract null and void under under the justice system, right? Because you recognize some coercion is worse than others, and we think religion is the most coercive kind of possible force in the world. So definitely it qualifies as a special circumstance, and we don't think that anyone in opposition has so far proven that it does not. Vote for a fair justice system, and vote for a justice system that restores order. Vote for closing government.
Okay, thank you very much. To conclude the debate, I'd like to invite Opwit. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yep.
We believe that this debate boils down to the question of what exactly, again, the justice system should be about. And as CO, we want to emphasize that the principle of the justice system must be about restoring order in society. And we don't think that CG's arguments correspond with this principle. So in this case, we are concerned largely with protecting society composed of individuals, citizens, who are victimized by heinous acts and subject to human rights violations due to religious violence, ranging from fundamentalist states as well as progressive nations, where religious extremism and radicalism disrupts everyday life. In order to deal with crimes of such religious nature, we believe that it is the obligation of the justice system and the state's justice system to ensure that the safety of citizens will never be compromised in such a way. As John has repeatedly emphasized, this means that the justice system cannot be flexible as to be inclusive of considering religious beliefs, allowing an infinitely great range of religious standards and ideals to permeate and distort the state's established ways of upholding and restoring order. Given this, Sean has uniquely brought to you two cases. Firstly, about how state justice systems must be about the restoration of order as opposed to recognizing the agency of individual actors. Secondly, about how this policy ends up diminishing and undermining the role of the state in maintaining and upholding its laws. All rebuttals will be integrated as I defend our given cases. So Sean talks to you, first of all, about how the justice system, he depicts the justice system as a promise, a relationship between the state and its people, wherein the state has an inherent obligation to safeguard its people. And when its laws are designed to, and when its laws are clearly designed to protect the people that are being breached, it is also the duty of the state and its mechanisms of justice to step in and penalize such actions accordingly. He responds to the notion of resisting bad law and democratic backsliding in certain nations as obviously extreme cases in religiously fundamentalist states, which we don't think is relevant in this debate because it does not address the actual the protection of the vulnerable peoples that we are concerned with here. So we think that this policy, in fact, allows for the further marginalization of certain peoples based on religious standards, right? Like the LGBT, other religious groups or whatnot, and women who are actively being victimized due to these religious crimes, and the leniency that is exercised due to the notion of indoctrination that impacts the agency of these individuals. So the question really is, how far can we possibly defend the idea of tradition, conventional or religious ideals? How can we possibly draw reasonable boundaries, given the fact that religion is just is an incredibly broad spectrum in which so many ideals permeate the notion of what is right and what is wrong. And so we believe that in this case, the justice system cannot be flexible if it is meant to, in fact, restore order in society. So we think in this case, in this case, the government's argument that religion takes away our agency and that the problem is structural and cultural does not overshadow the fact that at the end of the day, the state has a duty and obligation to protect its citizens through whatever means necessary. And so we think that opposition, in fact, doesn't we think that government doesn't the whole government bench doesn't actually consider the most vulnerable people who cannot opt out, right? Because we would like to so we oppose this notion because the fact is the people subject to crimes of religious fervor, these are people that we should be concerned about when using the justice system to safeguard society. I'll take any POIs if there are any right now. From OG.
You realize that your opening literally talks about using plea bargains as a mechanism for quote unquote restoring order, which is directly against your substantive, because even that is a form of mitigatory defense if you think about it.
We stand firm on the idea that the state as a whole has a duty to protect, uphold its laws, and therefore in this case, we don't think any plea bargaining is relevant to this case. We again just want to protect the secular model of the state, and so that goes on to our second case about why exactly this policy goes against the secular model of the state and ends up diminishing and undermining the role of the state in maintaining and upholding its laws. So we're responding directly to CG's case about how homegrown terrorism is actually mitigated on their side, which we just don't believe is true. The result of this policy is that the state is not able to protect the people that it was meant to. On government side, the world is not safer. They don't improve society precisely because they allow religious duty as a factor of mitigation, right? People are given more lenient sentences and let out faster, penalized and simultaneously rehabilitated from their indoctrination less. We think that rehabilitation is worse on their side, contrary to what they say. They also say that governments become more careful about shutting down religion and collaboration becomes better, but it's ironic because this is precisely, again, what we are trying to deal with here. This becomes an avenue for lenience to be exercised on these criminals and again, delegitimize the institutions of the state and its justice system. We don't think that this is a solution to the problem at hand, collaboration, wherein religious violence is clearly piercing the social and democratic institutions of the state and disrupting the lives of innocent people at hand. And so they say that they can moderate at least a few more individuals and lead towards rehabilitation. But we think actually, again, rehabilitation is better on our side. And the marginal individuals that they improve, again, in terms of agency, we don't think that overall solves the issue of the structural and cultural issue, cultural violence issue that they say stops these prohibits these individuals from obtaining sound rational minds. And so we think in our case, the world is safer ultimately on our side because we allow the state to protect its justice institutions that are already intact. And we think overall that this leads to closure being better on our side because the fact of the matter is when such crimes of such nature are committed, the criminals should not be treated lightly, treated in a way that the victims they must be treated in a way that the victims of the crimes also understand the punishment and can accept it, as opposed to sentences that become vastly different, mitigatory, and just overall unacceptable in the eyes of the victim due to religious standards. And therefore, this allows for a great range of flexibility in what the sentence can turn out to be. And so in this case, we think that closure for victims is ultimately improved on our side, and this is closure is improved on our side by way of using the state's institutions as a secular, justified, and already established manner of upholding criminal justice. So we think that by filling in the gaps that OHA has left as to what the justice system as to what the justice system should stand for, and the state's role in upholding these principles insofar as restoring order to society and protecting those that need it. We think that compensation and closure, as well as making sure that these crimes of this nature don't happen again, is a far more achievable outcome in our world. And so we think that in this case, the marginal benefit on our side is that we again uphold the state's duty and also legitimize the state's actions and ways of protecting the most vulnerable people in society. And so side with closing opposition.
Okay, thank you very much. Closing